Okay, so hi, I'm Yonty Friesem. I'm the Assistant Director at the Media Education Lab at the University of Rhode Island. Um, and I want to introduce this panel that started from, I think, a Twitter chat kind of talking about empathy. And I'm very excited to have the three of us together to brainstorm about the idea of how empathy and social justice and civic engagement can work or cannot work, and where are the challenges and where are the advantage of working together. So we have Peter Levin here with us, so I'm very excited, and Edwin Rutsch. So I guess I'll let each one introduce themselves. It will be better. So Peter, you want to start?
Sure. So I'm an academic geek. I'm the associate dean for research at the Tisch College of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts University, and the Lincoln Filene Professor of Civic Engagement.
And I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and an empathy activist, saying we need to create a culture of empathy and advocating for that.
So I think the idea of this panel was regarding Peter, your blog, asking about are there benefits for empathy, and is empathy really promoting civic engagement and social justice, or actually it's kind of holding back on some activities that can help promote social justice and civic engagement? So I don't know if you want to start kind of explaining your point of view, and then we'll have kind of discussion and questions, I guess, and kind of talking about it.
Yeah. So I think you found me because I made some critical comments about empathy. Mm-hmm. I don't have a really dug-in position. I'm open to anything, and I'm probably basically think that empathy is good if you really want to know. Yeah. But I was at a panel, and you know, the topic was empathy, and I guess I went to critical. I was supposed to prepare for it, and I went to some critical thoughts. I mean, they have to do, I think, with the relationship. Empathy feels like a relational, personal matter. It's between people, and at the human scale and within the household or within the neighborhood, or when two people bump into each other on the street, it seems very valuable to have empathy. I guess there's also a world, an impersonal world of laws and rights and governmental structures, and I worry a little that empathy doesn't make a change in those big structures. In fact, that things like rights are and ought to be very impersonal. That the point of a right is that you have it, whether people are empathetic to you or not. And I worry, kind of in the worst case scenario, that especially a privileged group gains genuine empathy for the group they're oppressing. So they really say, you know, we understand where they're coming from. We really feel that it's terrible, and that feels like an achievement for them. So they don't do anything good to change the situation. They feel better. Not only that, but to a third party, they actually become more effective. They look better, so they get a sort of points in the debate because they're empathetic, and so it's actually a resource. It's actually an asset that helps to secure their situation. And I'm not talking about insincere empathy, which is a different problem, where you are not really empathetic, but you're pretending you are. I'm actually talking about sincere empathy. And I think actually there are lots of, for example, privileged Americans who are very far from ending up in jail in America who are empathetic about the criminal justice, about the victims of a criminal justice system that they see as unjust, but they're not actually doing anything about it. So that's enough, but that's sort of my view.
So yeah, I mean, what I totally agree with that, and I think that there is a big problem with that. What I know that my stand on empathy, which is, I guess, a little bit different than most of the people, is the inclusive approach, that empathy is also self-empathy, but also part of an action. And as you say, to just empathize with somebody with your thoughts or with your feelings, for me, it's not genuine empathy because it doesn't have the action, the compassionate part of it. So if you're just by yourself empathetic to other people, you're not truly fully 100% because you're not doing anything about it. So just understanding what other people are thinking or feeling, that's not the whole experience of being empathetic without doing some kind of an action. Edwin?
Yeah, what you were bringing up, Peter, was I think in the justice system, for example, empathy. And I would say that the justice system, kind of at its core, is based on competition, kind of this idea that you hire a gladiator to kind of battle out and come to the truth somehow about external judgment. You have people externally judging you. And I think the idea is that in that framework, that there might be, in that competitive framework, that one side might be getting the empathy from the justice or the judge, or let's say the jury, that their story will be heard, they will be seen, and it'll be kind of registered, versus what I would call like a culture of empathy, which would be that all parties dialogue with each other on an equal footing until everybody feels heard. So by just one side being empathized with, that's actually, I would say that's actually an empathy deficit, because the deficit of empathy is for the people who aren't heard in that environment. So it's not the problem with empathy, it's a lack of empathy for the people who aren't being heard. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it makes sense. It does. I'm just thinking about some of the issues without even taking a side on them. Some of the issues that we might think about. I mean, one is the question of the Yonty put out there, which is, ought we to define empathy so that it includes action? And it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It goes to that. It could partly be a little semantic, because you could decide to define empathy so that it also includes positive action, and then it would make it easy. But it goes to that really ancient debate, because you have Socrates or somebody. No, you
Yeah,
have
Plato. Yeah,
Plato. Yeah. So
yeah.
it goes back to those guys. The question of whether truly believing the good must lead you automatically to doing what's good. It's a great old question, and I guess I've always believed in what Plato didn't believe in, but Aristotle did, which is weakness of the will. So the idea is that you can have true knowledge of the good but not do anything, and you can also do the good without having the right knowledge. So in this case, so the way I would, it's just a framework. It's not like I'm debating you, or that certainly not that I'm right and you're wrong, but the framework would be that you can genuinely have empathy for somebody, and because of weakness of the will, not do anything about it. On the other hand, you can not have any empathy. You can be a basically callous person, and you can do the right thing for a variety of reasons, in part because you're just guided by rules.
Mm-hmm.
So I would tend to distinguish, and then it becomes an empirical question whether having a lot of empathy leads to good action, and it probably does, but I think it automatically does. So that's one set of questions. The other set of questions have to do with it would come up well with the criminal justice system, which is, do we want to maximize empathy as the one safeguard of justice, or do we want to actually have systems which are, for example, intentionally competitive, or intentionally impersonal? So, I guess the other side of the argument, from the maximize empathy side, the other side of the argument is, no, we'd actually like to have rights, for example, that apply unequivocally to everybody, and that don't depend upon empathy. And in fact, they apply even to people who have really lost everybody's empathy because they're just really bad, or because they're outliers somehow from the society. So the rights are trump cards that you just get to play, and it doesn't matter whether you enjoy empathy. Likewise, we might want to have an adversarial criminal justice system because we think it's a path to truth. I mean, I think our criminal justice system's all messed up, but it might not be that it lacks empathy. It might be that it, for example, doesn't give enough bargaining chips to the defense. So the change there wouldn't be to increase empathy. It would be to change the. So I guess I basically believe in rules and incentives as well as psychological functions, and I would tend to distinguish them.
That's an interesting. So what you're saying is that empathy even with definition that it's with action and the more inclusive kind of definition, can sometimes be a barrier for somebody to get justice or to get a true kind of trial with, because empathy can interfere in a way. Would that be correct?
Well, yeah. So I don't know what my position is, but I guess one view would be empathy can interfere with with people's motivation to actually change a system, because they get too convinced that just by being empathetic they're doing the right thing. So actually, when I referred originally to the criminal justice system, I wasn't referring to the way it plays out in the courtroom, but I was referring to the uprisings in places like Baltimore, and thinking there are a lot of people who watch that and are very empathetic to the whole categories of people who are oppressed by a criminal justice system that's out of control. But I don't really see anybody doing anything much about it, in the circles where I walk. So lots of people around me are empathetic to the ordinary street level people in Baltimore, but they're not actually doing anything about it. But so that's part of the issue. But another part of the issue is, what would we think would be remedies? So do we think that the remedy to injustice in Baltimore is more empathy, or do we think the remedy to the situation in Baltimore is lower sentences? Or
yeah, well, I would add within the Baltimore framework, if people are having empathy, let's say for African Americans in their situation, first it's starting from almost like they are having empathy for African Americans. It's kind of coming from an individualistic attitude. It seems to me. It's framing already. So the question is people in Baltimore have empathic relationships already. It's almost like we can't not have it, because of that empathy is this foundational mirror neuron kind of a process that's happening whether we want to or not. We're kind of like biologically made. So we can talk about it, somebody having empathy for them, or we can say, what is the empathic relationship that's going on in that community, and is everybody empathizing with everyone else? So it's like, and where are the blocks to empathy? So it seems to me it's about creating a framework where all the participants can be in an empathic dialogue with each other, and it's through that empathic dialogue with each other that they really start seeing the deeper underlying needs, desires, and yearnings, and problems that people have, and then they co-create solutions. And so I would say what's kind of happening is, with the polarization, that there's not really a container being built for empathy for the police, empathy with the African Americans, and mutual empathy between them.
A lot of my heart wants to just thoroughly agree with that, and say that even some of my work has been in the same vein. The only thing I'd throw out is there's kind of people do have empathetic urges that you know more about than I do, but that seem very deeply rooted. But we also have very bad urges, urges to stereotype, to marginalize, to look out for ourselves and not for other people. And the classical liberal kind of move in political thought is to say people have good urges and they have bad urges. If let's not be dependent on their good urges prevailing. Let's create structures that aren't actually dependent on that. So Madison says, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. If men were devils, it would be impossible. Government would be impossible, but we're in between. And so what we need are things like checks and balances and limitations on power. So while it would be fantastic to have everybody at Baltimore in an empathetic conversation, the first step is actually to make sure that police officers aren't allowed to arrest people who are not actually breaking any laws, and if they put them in vans and they kill them there, that they face prosecution. That's a check and balance rather than so it's not dependent on empathy. It's dependent on an independent public prosecutor who's elected by the people in Baltimore. So it's a set of structures that are actually. So what I'm saying is, I'm talking too much, but what I'm saying is the framing vision of the Constitution is actually pretty explicitly saying, look, we're not going to actually be dependent upon virtue. Now, within that framework, I'd like to have more virtue, so I'm all for trying to have empathetic conversations. But I do think when the framework breaks down in the first place, for example, when the state starts killing people, that the first recourse needs to be to restore the checks and balances.
Mm-hmm. It sounds to me, the way that I hear the position of Edwin and of you, Peter, is that Edwin looks to the future as fostering a culture of empathy as an ideal, a place that we should be there. And you, Peter, what you're talking about is about those steps that we should take now with the reality now to get there as well. But you're looking at the actual system now and the things that are happening now and what should be done to make it kind of more dependent on the structure and not the virtues, as you said, just the virtues of
yeah,
the
although
person.
I'm not sure that I really believe in a utopian future where we can get rid of. I suppose my own view would be closer to we need that people have mixed virtues and vices, and that we need political systems that are somewhat impervious to their vices. Once we have those systems in place, then we need to be empathetic with each other within those systems. But I'm not sure that I believe that you could ever get past the systems being good, or that you could ever expect, that you could ever expect to put in place systems that would be thoroughly and permanently good, so that you wouldn't have to worry about them anymore.
You know, one thing I would, you're talking about good and bad. I was wondering if you could, for me, I actually reframe that it's not good and bad, it's empathetic and unempathic. So when you're saying, hey, we need structure, so I would reframe it in that we need structures to create more empathy. People aren't being empathic, and what can we do to create more structures to foster more empathy?
Can you be empathetic to somebody and at the very same time, in the very same mode, be harmful to them or unjust to them?
Could be harmful. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of George Lakoff. He's written about empathy and in linguistics kind of terms, and he has this model of like a very unempathic parenting style and political style and an empathic. And he's talking about the moderates in between are actually have mixed modes of that, so that at any one time we can be empathic and unempathic at the same time. And I've had that experience, like in a group of people, I feel very empathic towards someone, and someone else I really dislike and kind of have shut down. And then even in the relationship with someone, the empathy kind of comes and goes at I see it almost as like a speaker, levels, audio levels, that the empathy in relationship is actually kind of moving and changing all the time as well. So it's sort of a dynamic.
If the empathy meter is a separate meter, do you always want to see it as high as possible?
For me, yeah, that's what I try to work towards, is how do we maximize the empathic, the meter, increase the levels.
Right. Okay. So that's sounds like it's pretty foundational for you. So I'm just raising the question of whether empathy is even holding everything else constant, whether empathy itself is intrinsically desirable. And I'm just wondering, because I guess it's not the only virtue. Right. There's sort of a bunch of other ones like fairness and justice, and also respect for other people's liberty and independence from you, and a bunch of so there are a bunch of things we could value. And I'm just wondering, does empathy trade off against anything like that at any point?
Yeah, I guess for me, empathy is like a gateway to those. Like, until we can really empathize with each other, we can't really get to a sense of justice, because I don't know what the situation is, unless it's an externalized justice. There's like an internal justice where I say, oh, what I did here was not really fair to you, and I really see that what your needs were within the context. So I guess I see empathy as almost like this foundational gateway, and there's all kinds of, it leads to all kinds of other types of relationships, but that you need that as the foundation.
I think we need to, I mean, the way that I look at empathy, that it's both a skill and a process. So you have your own personal level of empathy that, as Edwin said, can change to a person, change to situation, but it's something that you, I would like to think, have some kind of a control over it, and you can enhance like a skill. But there's also the process of empathizing, that as much as you practice that, your skill enhance. So it can be like, you know, like writing or speaking. It's like a skill that has all the cognitive, emotional, but social also in it, that helps you kind of like practice this thing and have all those other virtues as well as you enhance it more and more. And people that you might have personal problem with, dislike, or whatever, you have an enhanced skill that you can go beyond that to see really the greater kind of like the fairness and the justice of what's happening in that situation.
There
I
is a
don't know if
lot
it's
of
clear.
theory built into this, which could be true, it's just not self-evident. I mean, one is that, you know, that there would be some kind of logic that first comes empathy, then comes something like equity or justice towards the other person. I don't know. I don't have any basis for saying that that's not correct. Maybe it is. I can imagine someone being highly equitable, for instance, basically not very much liking other people, but being thoroughly committed to the idea that they have a set of rights and really working to protect those rights. And another person being very good at being able to actually feel how the other person is feeling, and be able to fully articulate and actually mean, you know, oh, I see that this person is really suffering because of an unjust system that I'm part of, and not doing anything about it, and or even feeling a need to do, because I'm wondering if empathy is intrinsically connected to a sense of responsibility, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine someone who's rather sort of cold and very responsible.
So the way that I look at it, which is an issue that I wanted to raise to both of you and to have some kind of a talk about it, which is part of, I think, the problem that we experience a lot and heard a lot about empathy, and relates to exactly what you said, was that when it's one-on-one, even if it's somebody who is my enemy, I can sit down and see the human in this person because I'm looking into the other person's eyes, I'm talking, so the empathy is easier to practice. And part of the problem, and we have a research here that we're working on it as well with a company that works on donation, and it's really difficult to empathize with the whole society.
Right.
And so if we're taking back the Baltimore example, so I can go to Baltimore and empathize with the one policeman or one of the protesters, but to empathize with all the police department or empathize with all the citizens of Baltimore, that's a skill that is really, really difficult and one of the barriers of empathy. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a huge, huge challenge. And I think with your interest in civic action, I would be interested to hear your point of like, do you think it's possible to empathize, and are there ways to empathize with a community and not with an individual or like a small group?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer, but I feel that you're pushing the word empathy to include an awful lot.
Yeah.
And there's other vocabulary available. So it could be that we only have so here's just a proposal.
Mm-hmm.
We only have empathy for concrete other people whose names we know well, who you could imagine not knowing their name, but in weird circumstances. But generally, we have empathy for people we actually are engaging with. We know something about them, and then we have other appropriate attitudes that are either good or bad towards things like populations, communities, systems, nations, and those are best not. The better use other words like, you know, like like a sense of responsibility or solidarity, justice. But I keep on going back to the same vocabulary. I think we'd expand the vocabulary beyond what I'm using. So you might have, so that what we need is not an attitude of empathy towards the police department of Baltimore, but an attitude of fairness towards the police department of Baltimore as a whole. that is related perhaps to the attitude I would have towards an individual Baltimore cop if I was face to face to them.
Mm-hmm.
But the relation is pretty complex. And again, I could be the kind of person who has a very good capacity to have the right relationship with the individual Baltimore cop when they come face to face to them, but not a kind of person who's very good at actually making the system work better. And vice versa.
Okay.
And the thing is, it really does matter because I'm actually not going to be face to face with any Baltimore cops because I'm not planning to go to Baltimore. But I do have some kind of responsibility to the situation there. So the question is whether my capacity to interact well with the Baltimore cop has anything to do with what I really need at this moment, which might be things like the ability to sort of assess the system fairly, diagnose the situation, figure out what my leverage is as a voter or as a campaign contributor, use the leverage appropriately. I could maybe do that without having any empathy at all.
So do you look at, I mean, those examples seems like it's more analysis skill, cognitive skills that you're talking about. So like what is fair, how to analyze what's going on, how I'm interpreting, what can I do. It sounds very, very cognitive. Do you feel that empathy represents more an emotional state and then it lacks this cognitive part that you're talking about?
Well, that's an excellent question because I think it makes me change the way I want to present it a little bit. Because actually, I think you could have strong and appropriate emotions towards big things. For example, patriotism, which may or may not be appropriate, but patriotism is a strong positive emotion towards a whole country. And civic responsibility might be a feeling of commitment to something that isn't a country. And on the other hand, empathy has cognitive, as you both know more about empathy than I do, but empathy seems to have pretty powerful cognitive dimensions because it's partly a matter of actually understanding the real situation with the other person.
Yeah.
So you're not empathetic if you if you're just nice. You're empathetic if you're capable of understanding. You were earlier saying that empathy is a skill, and I would agree with that. So I guess I don't really want to make a reason-emotion distinction and put empathy in the emotion basket and justice in the reason basket. I think they're both a mix, but one difference is that justice often deals with scales that are too big for empathy, and with relationships which are appropriately distant. So my relationship with the person who made my shirt is a completely impersonal. I don't even know what country it's from. And if I did, it would turn out that the raw materials came from other countries. I mean, there's a tremendous distance between me and them. But I still have some obligations to them which may not be tied to empathy. I mean, they're tied to the fact that we're fellow human beings and they're also have rights. So if I fail to pay an adequate amount for that shirt, it's because of a lack of commitment to justice, not because of a failure to empathize with the individual. It's possible that if you actually bring me to Guatemala and I meet the shirt person, I will have a deep sense then of justice. So I agree with that it could be a pathway. But it's also possible that you could get me to pay more for my shirt instead of empathy by laying out statistics or by having me read some abstract theory or in a lot of other ways.
There's a thought that's coming up is I interviewed Lori Gruen, or if you know her, she's from Wesleyan University, and she wrote a book called Entangled Empathy. So she's gone through and compared an ethics of justice and an ethics of empathy and care. So she's kind of, so there's like basic premises underneath. I've got the book right back here. Actually doing an interview with her next week, an empathy circle with her and Jesse Prince, who's like against empathy, so that should be interesting. But she's going through the different premises because there's an ethics of justice has certain premises. The first one is kind of like we're individualistic. We're individuals, beings, with that sense of self-responsibility versus we're in relationship with each other. Whether we like it or not, we're in relationship with each other. So looking at the nature of the relationship, it's about looking, the justice is looking at kind of from abstract principles, moving towards abstract, generalized principles versus an ethics of empathy being about what's going on in context within the relationship. And she kind of goes through about 5 or 6 different points. I would say even justice is sort of like a transactional, has a transactional quality to it, whereas the empathy is more transformational, where we're really hearing each other and potentially, coming together into a whole different new understanding and emotional space with each other.
Is it possible that we need both and that they're not necessarily that neatly connected? In other words, that we need one for here in my office, I need empathy. In figuring out what shirt to buy, I need justice. And the two things, I mean, in the sense not of whether it's a nice shirt, but in the sense of whether I'm paying an adequate wage. And those two things are, they're both good. They're not, but they're somewhat separate, and they're not neatly. They're sometimes even in tension, because if I spend a lot of my life worrying about, as I probably do actually, about interpersonal relations. And I think actually as a human being, I'm actually much more concerned with interpersonal relations, and this is not presenting my personality very well, because I'm probably, if anything, obsessed with the detailed interpersonal relations and getting them right. But I'm not doing anything about, justice. So the two things could come. So I'm not the kind of person who's naturally into sort of like big laws and systems, and I'm actually naturally into trying to make sure I understand the individual people I know well. But I feel pretty deficient on the justice scale, especially if you ask, what am I doing about it?
Well, one thing I look at is in terms of looking at how do we build a culture of empathy. So instead of just thinking about me and the person that's doing the shirt, are they in a context which is an empathic environment? So how do we build so that they're working in an empathic environment, so that there's that empathic relationship between their employer and in their society as well, so that we actually raise the level, because a lot of those societies are very authoritarian and they don't have a voice and they're not being heard.
But I guess the question is that the only thing? Is that the pathway to making everything better? Because so I would love for the factory to be empathic, but they're also in a different context, which is a global market with 7 billion people. So it can't really be interpersonal at that level. But at that level, we could ask, are they getting paid enough? And you could be in a very empathic little factory where it could even be a workers' co-op, and they could be doing their best to care for each other, but they're all getting screwed by the global economic system. You could have a just economic system in which there was fair prices being paid for the goods, and an unempathetic factory. Now that latter is not satisfactory, but it could be better than an empathetic factory in an unjust global
so
market.
Is there other tools besides empathy to create kind of positive environments, and are rules and structures also a path towards having more well-being for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you believe that it's all empathy, then you are driven towards some views which I'm sort of sympathetic for, but I can't quite commit to, which are all about how everything should be small. I think I still have "Small is Beautiful" out of the library, the 1968 or so manifesto, and it's a good book. But one of the things it would say is you can't really have trade between the factories in Guatemala and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and consumers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because that's a global marketplace. It can't be empathetic. So we need to it's an radical economic manifesto, and one of the pieces of it is break up economies and make them hyper small. I guess I just don't really believe in that. I just don't think it's going to happen. So then I'm more inclined to think we should have multiple levels of analysis.
That's interesting, because I mean, eventually, yes, we're using computers, we're using different systems that dehumanize the people and the trades, as you say, but at the end of the day, it's people trading with people, and you need the interpersonal communication. And are those kind of like ways of communication can be more empathic to make it a more just place? like trading and for like those kind of negotiation, trading, business that happens.
Maybe, and it sounds like we should try. I guess I'm not sure that at the end of the day the relations need to be between human beings. I mean, when money came along a long time ago, what it did was it mediated relationships so that they no longer had to be personal the way barter and other kinds of exchange are. So money was an impersonal token. That's the point of it, and it sure produces a lot of efficiencies and also, in some ways, freedoms, because you're not quite as thoroughly, while it's good to be relational, it's bad to be under somebody else's thumb. And when you have the ability to use a token like money to make an impersonal, so that, for instance, the person who buys my thing doesn't have to like me, because I can buy and sell through the medium of money. We become more free in some ways. And I use money as a very, very old technology, but all the new technologies just maximize that. They've more impersonalized. So one view would be this is just all terrible, but that view is extremely sort of nostalgic and somewhat romantic. The other view is, well, we get some benefits from depersonalizing. We get benefits of efficiency and also of freedom.
But I feel that what I'm talking about, dehumanizing, is not the same thing that you're talking about, because
right.
Not knowing who created my iPhone, that's the dehumanizing that I'm talking about. But the ability to have the money to pay for it, or the person who actually built it, whatever the wage is, to be able to earn something that will help her or him to live in a certain way, that's a different freedom that I think encourage this kind of like, you call it romantic kind of, but this kind of way. So I'm saying I totally agree that the mediated communication through money, digital tools, whatever it is actually a benefit. I mean, I'm working with digital tools, and that's my part of like the educational part that I'm using media. So I'm totally on that. But can we use, and that's part of my research, this mediated communication to create a greater bond? And it doesn't need to mean that I need to be the best friend of the child who created my iPhone, but can I think about this person or the whole chain of people who created this iPhone and see, what am I doing with it? Is it for the good or not? How am I helping them or not? And so I have this freedom, but also I have the responsibility. That's what I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 100% for it. I think that's awesome. So in some ways I'm just pushing back because you asked me to on. So I suppose the sort of strong version. So I'm 100% for what you're doing. I guess the strong version of the position that I was taking in my blog post was that there could be a trap there where the user of the iPhone gets very interested in the person who produces it and really comes to understand them and finds it interesting and feels better about themselves for that and pays way too little for the iPhone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. We have like 15 minutes, and I don't know, Edwin, if you want to add. I have one question that I wanted to ask.
I guess just the approach that I look at, or the way of thinking, is in terms of that person creating the iPhone. It's that whatever that society that they're living in, it's not just the relationship of me deciding whether to pay more or less or whatever for the iPhone. It's about advocating for and working towards creating an empathic environment there. So,
right.
So it's really for kind of global transformation that empathy becomes like a primary social value in cultures all around the world, and that they become, because they might be, the person that's creating that iPhone might be like a psychopath for that matter, right? Or would be pretty low in empathy. They might be going home beating their kids, right? So and even if they got more money, they might still beat their wife and their kids. So it's really about, we're all in an global empathic relationship. We're just not doing it as well as we could. We could just just maximizing you know, as much as possible is kind of the goal of the intention, or the thing that I'm kind of working on. Even with the empathy tent, which you saw here in Berkeley, that's it. I think that was the tweet. You had that photo of me at the empathy tent, kind of advocating for empathy in downtown Berkeley.
Yeah, great.
So my question is, I've been following some of your work, Peter, since you published in 2008 what's relating to my field of media literacy about the lack of audience with kids who are producing in the volume about civic engagement and identity and of MIT. And that has been very valuable to read about that and to understand. And in my personal work with youth at risk, little kid with adults, adolescents, that if they don't have an authentic audience when they're creating media, it really kind of devalue their civic engagement. If they're doing a PSA and they know that nobody's going to see that, it doesn't have any value to it. And that's something that I'm advocating when I'm doing professional development with teachers and when I'm working with kids. It's a very initial thing. And it's highly related to what we're talking about empathy, to know that you're creating something for somebody else and to know how to analyze it. And so all this introduction to my question, which is we're talking really high in philosophy and high in like justice and everything, but going back to more realistic, more tangible kind of, what is your point of what are steps that we can do? As I read, you know, that's why I wanted to do this discussion, because I know a little bit about your opinion from what I read. What is possible for us to do now as educator, as activist, to really foster this human connection? So maybe not empathy, if the definition is kind of, but when we're talking about this human connection, about this bonding and social responsibility on your end.
Yeah. Well, you know, actually, we don't have a disagreement about a lot of the practical stuff. I mean, I think I won't speak for you two guys, but I mean, I do actually agree with Edwin's agenda when it comes to what we should do tomorrow. I mean, I think a lot of my work is obsessed with the decline in measures of this. If you ask Americans, do you work with a neighbor to address a problem, or do you go to a meeting? There were big, deep declines in the latter half of the 20th century before the internet came along, so it's not the fault of the internet. And maybe nowadays we need to do them online. I mean, this is a pretty interactive session we're doing at this moment. But my point is, I'm worried about that decline, because I think we do actually interact with each other less than we used to. And in some ways, the conversations are less diverse, too. They're maybe a little better on race, but there's terrible ideological divisions where people don't show up in the same room with each other. And there are terrible differences in professional gaps by professional background. So it used to be that working class people and middle class people were in the same room often, but they're really not anymore. And I think we do need to build those things up through various kinds of projects, like probably the ones you do with kids, Yonty. So I'm for that. I think one of the issues that I was trying to raise in that paper, which thank you for reading, is that often the myth is of the kids being so effective as communicators that they'll reach a huge audience, because their YouTube video will go viral and 1 million people will see it. And those myths obviously go around because they do happen. And of course, those are the famous examples, so everyone knows them. But if you actually get together with a group of kids, they're not going to reach millions of people unless they're extremely lucky. So part of it is learning to address a real audience that's of a reasonable scale in a strategic way, so that they'll actually hear you. And that audience is more likely to be 30 people than 30 million.
Right.
But it's worth talking to 30 people if you can do a good job.
Yeah, definitely. So what I wanted to know is a little bit about the center at Tufts, the things that you're working with your students and initiatives that you're doing. I don't know, just in Massachusetts or like even national-wide kind of. What are those kind of projects?
Mostly we study civic engagement and civic participation, which includes deliberation and dialogue like Edwin's talking about, it includes online media production, but mostly we study it in the sense of either doing evaluations of programs or experiments or looking at the national data, how many people go to meetings and why and where are they and what does it lead to and that kind of question. So we don't do a lot of programming ourselves, although some of the experiments that we do are close to programs. So right now we're running an experiment in Florida schools, 7th grade classrooms, where the kids are using handheld devices to structure a conversation in the classroom. The handheld device tells you sort of who to talk to next and poses questions, but you orally communicate with each other. So we're testing that out. The point there is that a 7th grade classroom is a pretty rowdy place and it's very time constrained. So can we use the devices to make quick conversations that actually are productive?
Okay, great. Edwin, do you have anything to add or to ask?
Well, I was just thinking about the civic engagement. There was a book out about there's a theorist talking about civic engagement. Can't remember the book right now where I have that, but he talks about the sort of the theory of deliberation, that it was very rationalistic. It's been very rational, that if we can all just sit together and reason together, then we'll come to these great solutions, but it hasn't really worked. And so it's kind of coming from, kind of Enlightenment reasoning, which again, George Lakoff talks about the premises of Enlightenment reasoning. He kind of goes through how they're kind of inaccurate according to current science. And so anyway, this theorist is saying, well, we need to, into this deliberation, we need to bring more empathy so people can really hear what's really going on for people at, at their real lived emotional experience. And so he's just saying that needs to come more into the deliberation part.
I will just say that I've been doing research on deliberation for 25 years. Not that it's effective or important or anything, but it's been the thing that I do. And I feel that what you just described is the current mainstream now. I mean, it used to be, because Jürgen Habermas, the German theorist, put deliberation on the agenda, and he's got a very cognitive view of it. It's very much about the best reason. And that was pretty influential in the 80s. But I think almost everybody now thinks of deliberation as being highly emotional, affective. And a lot of the questions are about, well, what's the right affect under what circumstances?
And so it's actually been more accepted than I was aware of that.
Well, that's just my perspective, but I think I don't know which theorist you're talking about specifically, but part of the reason I don't is because I feel like that's becoming more the mainstream view. And people are also less likely to want to separate the affects from the cognition anyway. So it's really hard to name an emotion that isn't pretty cognitive, or a cognitive position that isn't pretty emotional.
I just did a quick search on it. It was Michael Morell. He has the book Empathy and Democracy, Feeling, Thinking, and Deliberation.
Oh, cool. I actually don't know it at all.
Okay.
So, yet another thing I've learned.
So again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, because it's we feel that those kind of conversations, and also putting it online and have people looking at it and spark kind of ideas and think about it. So we think it's important. So I'm very thankful for you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, speaking for myself, that was really fun. Thank you. And I'll try to tweet out the link or whatever if you send it to me.
Yeah.
Will do. Great.
So thank you very much, Edwin, Peter. So great conversation.
Thank you
very much.
And talk to you again.